So thank you so much, Einat, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. Um, the Classical Forum for Contemporary Issues was formed in the wake of the anti-Israel demonstrations that swept through academia as a reaction to the massacre of Jews on October 7th. The forum is composed of scholars from classics and related disciplines such as history, philosophy, and political science. We seek to bring to academic audiences voices that have been silenced or are rarely heard on campuses today, including pro-Israel and pro-Western voices, as well as dissident voices from non-democratic authoritarian societies. We seek to provide a forum for tolerant and respectful discourse on topics of vital importance for the future of our civilization. It is a great pleasure and honor to have as our speaker tonight Dr. Einat Wilf, the author of many books and articles. She is probably the world's greatest expert on the Israel-Palestine conflict. We live in a world of binary cookie cutter thinking where everything has to fit into a neat category, even if it doesn't, and where murder can become justified if the wrong word is applied in the wrong place. Dr. Wilf is not a binary thinker. She's a liberal academic with rich political experience, but one who thinks for herself and draws her own conclusions. She'll be speaking tonight on the subject, what is the conflict about? And how will it end?
Pleasure to be with you. For years when I would give this talk and I would introduce it and say, look, I'm going to tell you what the conflict is about and how will it end, everyone would laugh. And then I would say, you know what? You can hold me to it by the end of the talk. So basically, when I look at this issue, I start with my personal story of having grown up in Jerusalem and Beit HaKerem, in a kind of social and political environment where everyone voted for the Labor Party. I grew up into the politics of the Labor Party. And in the 80s and 90s, as a young adult, the Labor Party moves away from its association with socialism, increasingly to become known as the Party of Peace. And especially the idea of land for peace and the idea that if we only negotiate with the Arabs, with the Palestinians, hand over land acquired in 67, then we have a path to peace. And for a while, it really seemed to work. This was the basis for the peace agreement with Egypt. We can discuss how that turned out. But that was the basic idea. Now, the 90s were really this decade of euphoria, right? I voted for Rabin. I voted for Barak. This is already a time when I can vote. I support every prime minister who's going to who basically implements the idea of land for peace. I'm euphoric when Ehud Barak goes to Camp David, right? A leader of the Labor Party, of the peace camp, elected much more than Rabin on the specific mandate of making peace. And he puts on the table a proposal. Happily, finally, Clinton spoke to it recently. But Barack puts on the table a proposal that addresses everything that we were told stands between us and peace. A Palestinian state, fully sovereign, meaning no more occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites, the Temple Mount, the Muslim Quarter, no settlements that were going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land. So basically, all the Palestinians had to do was say yes. And of course, Arafat walks away in 2000. Abu Mazen walks away from a similar proposal in 2008. They follow it up with intense violence. And also, probably the most important aspect is that there are no dissenting voices for what they just did. So basically, like, you don't see Palestinian voices that say, hey, we were about to get everything we've always wanted, go get back there into the negotiating room and get us everything we've ever fought for. There are no such dissenting voices. And in the case that people think that Palestinian society allows no dissent, I always let people know that there were actually plenty of dissenting voices and criticism of Arafat when he dared negotiate with Israel. But there were no dissenting voices when he walked away from the negotiations. So as I lived through that time of the euphoria in the 90s, the violence and massacres of the early 2000s, the collapse of Camp David, the collapse of the disengagement from Gaza, the collapse of the negotiations of Olmert. So it's like a decade and a half, I begin to ask a very simple question. Then what do the Palestinians want? Because they clearly don't want a state, and they clearly don't care about ending the occupation, and they clearly don't care about settlements, and they clearly don't care about Jerusalem. Or you might say, okay, now this is a bit of an extreme phrasing of the Palestinian position. So then I will just put a scale and I will say, look, let's imagine a scale. And on one side of the scale is everything I just mentioned: the Palestinian state, sovereignty, no occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem. There is something on the other side of the scale that they value so much more that again and again they will walk away from this package in order to pursue that other thing. What is that other thing? And as I'm asking this question, I meet Palestinians, I do the research that becomes the book, The War of Return, and I realize, really, to the credit of Palestinians, they've always told us what they wanted. We just didn't listen, or when we listened, it sounded so outrageous that we assumed that it's just like bluster or merely a maximalist negotiating position. But they've been very consistent, and they always told us, from the river to the sea, right? Palestine will be free. Of what exactly? Well, go to the original Arabic, from water to water. Palestine will be Arab, right? No Jewish state, no Jewish sovereignty. That was their vision, and they've been very consistent. And as I'm going through this process, you know, sometimes when I describe all of it and people hear what I describe, they say, oh, you've moved from the left to the right. I very much continue to call myself a person of the left. But then I tell them, look, it's not that I kind of changed my political inclinations or changed my opinions, or I loved red and now I love the color blue. I tell them this was actually a much more scientific process, if you will. I had a hypothesis. The hypothesis had a lot to recommend it. The hypothesis was that what stands between us and peace is Palestinian statehood and everything that's associated: land, settlements. That was a hypothesis, and it was based on quite a few things. Then the hypothesis was tested. That's the important thing, because a lot of people like to kind of skip over the fact that the hypothesis was tested. Two Israeli prime ministers, Barak and Olmert, proposed Palestinians. Everything based on this hypothesis: land, sovereignty, statehood. Palestinians walk away. Ariel Sharon disengages from Gaza, essentially handing over land to Palestinians without demanding full peace and an agreement. Also another way to test the hypothesis. It was tested. Everyone, or so many people, are trying to erase the fact that Israel repeatedly tested the hypothesis. I sometimes hear people describe the last few decades like this. There was Rabin. Rabin wanted to make peace. He was assassinated by a right-wing extremist. And then there was Netanyahu, and Netanyahu prevented a Palestinian state. The end. And this kind of telling jumps over 20 years when Israel actually tried, right? 5 years after Rabin was assassinated, Barak is elected in a landslide with a mandate to offer Palestinians what Rabin, on the eve of his imagination, did not imagine in his worst nightmares offering. And Arafat walks away from what Barak offered. So the hypothesis was tested and it collapsed completely. So as I try to answer what's the alternative hypothesis that fits with the data, I find, as I said, that Palestinians have always told us, from the river to the sea. And I found a quote in my research that I've been using ever since. It's great because it's the entire conflict and it's the alternative hypothesis in a nutshell, in one sentence. It's by Ernst Bevin from February 47. He goes to the British Parliament to explain why Britain failed to fulfill the terms of the mandate to help the Jewish people achieve sovereignty. It fulfilled the terms of the mandate to the Arabs, it created Transjordan and Iraq, but it failed the mandate to the Jews. So he needs to explain why Britain failed. So he says the following: His Majesty's government is thus faced with an irreconcilable conflict. Now, this is February 47. There are no settlements, there's no occupation, there's no Bibi, there's no Arab refugees, there's no Nakba, there's no state of Israel for that matter. So all of the things that we are told are the causes of the conflict don't exist yet. So there's no excuses. And he goes on to say, His Majesty's government is thus faced with an irreconcilable conflict. Irreconcilable already in February 47, when there's no settlements and occupation and refugees? And he goes on to explain. He says, in the land, there are Jews and Arabs. No one's called a Palestinian yet. And he says each one of those groups has one top priority. He says for the Jews, the essential point of principle is to establish a Jewish state. So the Jews want to exercise the universal principle of self-determination for the Jewish people in their homeland, right? And then he goes on to say, and for the Arabs, and these are the Arabs that will one day hijack the name Palestine to be called Palestinians, he says for those Arabs, he says their top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. Interesting. He's not saying the Jews want a state, the Arabs want a state. We'd love some help in drawing a fair border. He's saying, as a matter of top priority, the Jews want a state, and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. By definition, irreconcilable. And this is the alternative hypothesis. And unfortunately, that hypothesis explains all the data. Everything fits. From February 47 to the present day, whenever the Arabs of the land were faced with a choice, you can have your own state in part of the land, but the Jews will also have a state in the other part of the land. To date, they have always walked away and went to war, because every partition proposal from 37 to 2008 and even later, Trump is now going to be president again. The Trump partition proposal was also met with Abu Mazen's response of no, no, and 1,000 times no. So every time that they were proposed, you get a state, but the Jews also get a state. True to their singular focus and priority, they have always walked away and went to war, because to them, their top priority is no Jewish state, then everything else. Okay, so this is the conflict. That's it. Actually, quite simple. The conflict in that sense is not complicated. Maybe it's complicated in the details and what happened for the last 100 years, but in that aspect, it's not complicated. So if this is the conflict, how does it end? Actually, it ends quite simply with one of the sides giving up their top priority. That's it. That's the only way the conflict ends. Either the Jews no longer have a state. That's one way the conflict ends, right? That fulfills the Arabs' top priority. Or the Arabs finally let go of their top priority of a singular opposition to a Jewish state. That's basically it. That's how the conflict ends. Clearly, I'm partial to the view that I'd like the conflict to end with the Arabs finally letting a Jewish state exist. I think it's the more humane result. But that's basically it. And the reason that the conflict has not been solved to date is that both sides think they're winning. I sometimes not really joke, but I say that the conflict is basically a century-long battle of mutual exhaustion. The Arabs are trying to exhaust the Jews to give up on our top priority by wars, terrorism, economic boycotts, lawfare, international condemnations. They're basically trying to exhaust the Jews to say, you know what? Not worth it. We're out of here. This is just not worth all the wars and terrorism and the sacrifice and the international condemnations. We're done. We're out of here. So as far as they're concerned, they see enough indications that they're on the right track. One more generation, 5 more generations. They sometimes call Israel the second Crusader state. The Crusader state lasted for 88 years with Jerusalem, nearly 200 without Jerusalem. From the Arab and Islamic timeline, they're on the right track. Sooner or later will be gone. So they're continuing and they're refusing to budge. And we refuse to budge because we see enough indications that they are finally being exhausted into accepting us. And of course, we're also refusing to give up because this is actually our home. This is what the conflict is about and how it will end. There you go.
Thank you, Einat, for that. That simple sounding, very simple sounding summary hides a wealth of information.
Thank you so much, Einat, for your talk and enlightening us with your views. Thank you, everybody who participated and shared. We hope to see you again real soon.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you.